Obi-Wan Kenobi was never killed by an opponent he fought. The most powerful opponent he ever faced was Anakin Skywalker, and Anakin never finished him. Not because Obi-Wan was stronger, not because he was faster, but because Obi-Wan had spent years removing the one thing every opponent needs: something to attack. Form 3, Soresu, designed not to defeat, but to survive. The central question of this video isn't whether Soresu is powerful. The question is, how does the most defensive lightsaber form ever developed produce arguably the most consistently lethal duelist in the entire Jedi Order? In this video, we're examining 5 dimensions of Soresu, and one of them completely inverts what you think you know about Obi-Wan as a fighter. There's a specific moment in his life where he almost never committed to Soresu at all. We'll get there. But first, we need to understand what Soresu actually is, because almost every description of it misses the point entirely.
Tight movements, maximum deflection, minimum exposure. That's the standard summary, and it explains almost nothing about why the form is dangerous. According to the Jedi Path, an in-universe training manual published as a Legends reference work by Daniel Wallace, Soresu prioritizes survival above all else, building what it describes as a near-impenetrable fortress of defense. The same source traces the form's development across generations as a response to the increasing prevalence of ranged weapons, predating the Clone Wars by centuries. Almost no Jedi committed to it fully, because full commitment means accepting that you will absorb punishment indefinitely without retaliating. Every motion exists solely to keep the user alive one moment longer than the opponent can sustain the attack. Describing Soresu as defensive is like calling a siege a camping trip. Technically accurate, completely wrong about the strategic intent. A siege makes the enemy's destruction inevitable by removing every option except surrender or exhaustion. That is a far more dangerous operating principle than offense. Soresu isn't a defense, it's a slow-motion guarantee. The form doesn't ask who is stronger, it asks who runs out first. And it is built from first principle to ensure the answer is never the Soresu practitioner. So we understand what Soresu is, but what does it do to the person on the other side of the blade? There's a specific number we'll return to shortly, but first, consider the attacker's perspective. You strike, nothing happens. You strike again, nothing happens. The defender doesn't flinch, doesn't retreat, shows no fear, no reaction that gives you useful information. Across multiple episodes of the Clone Wars, Anakin's frustration with Obi-Wan's combat philosophy is a sustained and explicit theme. His aggressive Form 5 stands in direct contrast to Obi-Wan's patience, addressed repeatedly in dialogue throughout the series. General Grievous, who, as shown across the Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith, had trained in multiple lightsaber forms, became visibly erratic and lost positional control against Obi-Wan on Utapau in Revenge of the Sith. Neither opponent was outmatched in raw capability. What Soresu denied them was something more fundamental: feedback. Every combat system depends on reading the opponent's reactions. Soresu gives the attacker nothing to read, no openings, no emotional tells, no escalation to match. An opponent who provides no feedback forces the attacker to generate errors independently out of frustration, impatience, and the weight of a threat that refuses to behave like one. Soresu doesn't just protect the body, it engineers the opponent's collapse from within. By the time a fighter recognizes they are losing, they have already been losing for several minutes, and every aggressive action accelerated that process. Here's where the physical reality of Soresu becomes impossible to argue with, and where the word defensive finally breaks down completely. Earlier, we flagged a specific number. Here it is. Exercise physiology research, including foundational work by Dr. Per Olaf Ostrand on human anaerobic capacity,
consistently shows that maximal explosive output degrades significantly within approximately 60 to 90 seconds without recovery. Soresu's minimal movement profile operates far below that threshold. A fully committed Soresu practitioner maintains peak effectiveness while every aggressive opponent moves progressively toward exhaustion. The paradox is precise. The form designed never to strike first consistently produces the fighter still standing at the end. Obi-Wan defeated Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace, engaged him across the Clone Wars without either achieving a decisive outcome, and delivered the final defeat in Star Wars Rebels Season 3, Episode 20, Twin Suns. He defeated Grievous on Utapau and Anakin on Mustafar, both in Revenge of the Sith. None of those fights ended because Obi-Wan overpowered anyone. All ended because his opponents exhausted something first. Maul exhausted his control, Grievous his positional advantage, Anakin his high ground. Obi-Wan did not improvise that last one. He waited for it. He does not improvise. The defensive form wins by being fully dangerous at the precise moment every opponent has nothing left. That is not passivity. That is the most calculated expression of combat intelligence in the Jedi Order. And it still doesn't explain the most important question about Obi-Wan. If this is the kind of deep dive you're here for, hit like and subscribe.
Everything we've covered explains the mechanics of Soresu, but there is one fact that reframes the entire story, and it begins with a death on Naboo. Obi-Wan did not grow up as a Soresu practitioner. So what actually drove him to commit to the form that would define his entire fighting life? As a Padawan, Obi-Wan trained in Form 4, Ataru, fast, acrobatic, aggressive, Qui-Gon Jinn's form. On Naboo, in the Theed Power Generator Complex, he watched Qui-Gon die at the hands of Darth Maul. The mechanism is precise and visible in The Phantom Menace. Ataru requires open space, separated by an energy barrier and fighting alone in a confined corridor. Qui-Gon was left momentarily static, and Maul ended the fight in that single moment of stillness. According to the Jedi Path and the legend source, the Clone Wars Campaign Guide, Obi-Wan's commitment to Soresu following Naboo was a deliberate strategic decision, a conscious response to what aggressive forms cost under real combat conditions. This is not a story about Jedi discipline. It is a story about grief, converted into architecture. Obi-Wan looked at the exact mechanism of Qui-Gon's death and built his entire fighting life around one counter principle: construct a form with no weakness to find. Choosing to discard the form of the master you loved in favor of the form that would have kept him alive is not reactive. That is the most ruthless possible form of loyalty. You were the chosen one. It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Revenge of the Sith. He said that on Mustafar, still unbeaten, still standing, carried there by a form built on the grave of Qui-Gon Jinn. The longest act of grief in Star Wars is not a funeral, it is a fighting stance.
Obi-Wan survived Order 66. Of all the facts in this video, that one is the most consequential, and Soresu is the reason the math works out the way it does. The scale of the Purge is established across Revenge of the Sith and its novelization by Matthew Stover. The Jedi Order was reduced to a scattered handful of confirmed survivors within hours. Obi-Wan was among them. He then survived a direct confrontation with Anakin at the peak of his power, on terrain specifically chosen to neutralize Anakin's aggressive Gemso style. He walked away. Anakin did not. What Soresu offered against Order 66 was something no other form could provide. It required nothing of the opponent's psychology. Mace Windu's Vapad, as described in the Revenge of the Sith novelization by Matthew Stover, functioned by channeling the opponent's own darkness back against them. Clone troopers had neither darkness nor personal aggression. They had orders. Vapad had nothing to draw from. Yoda's Ataru required speed and open space. neither available in the Senate chamber. Soresu required only stillness and the refusal to be the one who ran out first. Here is what I think the prequel trilogy never quite states directly and should have. Soresu was the only lightsaber philosophy structurally resistant to Order 66, not because it was the most powerful form, but because it was the only form that asked nothing of circumstance. The clones had numbers and surprise. What they did not have was infinite stamina against a practitioner trained to outlast everything. Obi-Wan spent 19 years on Tatooine, waiting, conserving, still carrying the only combat philosophy that had never needed to strike first to win. That is not a man in exile. That is a loaded gun that never needed to be fired to be dangerous.